Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Heritage Talks, brought to you by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. My name is Glenn Patterson, and I'm one of the directors at the network. Working the Zoom and live streaming tech production today is my colleague, the ever-talented Allison Kirkwood. And Heritage Talks is made possible thanks to the generous support of the Zeller Family Foundation and Canadian Heritage. I want to welcome you all joining us today on Zoom, Facebook Live, or on Quan's YouTube channel. If you're on Zoom, keep your microphones muted and your video cameras off just during the first part of today's broadcast. Of course, during the Q&A that follows, Zoom attendees are invited to turn their video cameras back on and unmute yourselves if you have any questions. If you're on Zoom, you can use the view icon in the top right to toggle between the so-called gallery view and speaker view layouts. I think the speaker view is a better experience. That would be my suggestion, but as you wish. For those joining on Facebook and YouTube, leave us a comment. Let us know where you're joining us from today, and if you have any questions as well, you can leave them in the chat box below. So just a little bit about Quan. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan network of members that's open to all. For everyone joining live right now, we always do this during our live broadcasts. We're running a special promotion. So for the length of today's program, we're giving a 30% off the cost of an individual year-long membership. So for $20, you can become a member of Quan today. And among other perks, membership comes with a subscription to our beautiful quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News. And this is filled with wonderful editorials, articles on local history and heritage topics, book reviews, and news from the network. This most recent one includes an article by tonight's speaker, in fact. So if you're on Zoom, just send us a message in the chat box to claim the discount, and we'll get in touch after the broadcast. If you're on Facebook and YouTube, just send us a message there or send us an email to home@quan.org. Make sure to provide your name, mailing address, along with your email. We also do accept e-transfers and PayPal to the same email address, home@qahn.org. So 2025 marks a quarter century since our network first came together. And as a network, our strength is our membership. These are the small museums, archives, historical societies, community groups, and passionate individuals found in every corner of the province who, in various ways, protect, steward, and share the cultural memory of Quebec's English-speaking communities. So to celebrate our 25th year as a network, our series this winter and spring is all about celebrating some of the unsung heroes who, often from behind the scenes, laid the foundations of Quebec's diverse English-speaking heritage sector. What motivated these people, many of them community volunteers, to devote themselves so passionately, sometimes for years or decades, to the cause of our cultural heritage? What challenges did they face and overcome, and what lessons did they learn along the way? I think exploring these people's stories, it's not only a way to honor their legacies, it's also a way for us to become inspired and to take their examples and lessons forward into our own communities. And I would now like to introduce tonight's speaker, who herself is a pioneering figure in historical and demographic research about Montreal's Black history. So Dr. Dorothy Williams is the author of Blacks in Montreal and The Road to Now, a history of Blacks in Montreal. She has a wealth of knowledge about Canada's Black history and has consulted on several Canadian films and research. She has developed the ABCs of Canadian Black History Kit for teaching Black history in our schools. She teaches the only course on Black Montreal at Concordia University. Her research interests include Black health, gender, immigration, school retention, anti-racism initiatives, and community affairs. Dr. Williams has been honored with numerous awards. The most recent include the John G. Dennison Award, the inaugural exhibition in the Afro Musée, the first Black museum in Quebec, the Order of Montréal, an Honorary Doctorate from UQAM, and the King Charles III Coronation Medal. Hi, Dorothy, and welcome to Quan Heritage Talks.
Good evening, Glenn. I hope you can hear me.
Sure
All's well?
can.
Great, fabulous. Good evening, everybody that's come to share with me this evening. It's my research, and just bear with me. I hope you can all see that. So this is what the talk is going to be about: how the Black community was developed from about the early 70s. And it's really about moving away from a social work concept to Black community development. And I want to talk about that this evening. So I'm here to do a presentation specifically on the Negro Community Centre in Montreal.
Dorothy, just to stop you for a sec. I think your slides, maybe you didn't click share screen in the end.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Um, so you're not
It's
seeing
the
the slides, eh?
Yeah, hop over to Zoom. It's the green button on the bottom. We stopped your share earlier.
All right,
Um,
that's fine.
hate to destroy your flow like that, but you'll get it
No,
back.
it's all right. I'm not going to repeat what I just said, but I hope you can see that now because we actually had turned it on and then turned it off. So,
Yeah,
um, can you see the screen now?
yeah. Click from beginning and you're good to go.
Yeah, I did. That was a
All
little bit
right.
of,
Yeah,
all right,
all
that's
right.
fine.
You got it.
Okay, so I was actually just talking about myself and what I was doing this evening. So again, I'm not going to go back, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork, which is really about this talk is really about how the NCC seeded community development. What was the that sort of crucial point, and almost we could pick the day or pinpoint the day as to when that happened. And so I want to share with you what the legacy of that has been, and I hope you'll enjoy the moments with me. I'm going to actually be talking about the BCAs, which are derived from the Black Community Central Administration of Quebec. And that was a unit that was developed out of the Negro Community Centre. So now at this point, it may sound a little bit confusing, so I'm going to explain it plainly tonight. That's in fact the whole point of this discussion. But before I get into that, I want to describe a little bit more about who I am. Not everybody is aware of my career passions and what I've been doing in community development, entrepreneurship, and history. So I'm just going to lay the context. It's very, very much related to the Negro Community Center. I was born and raised in Little Burgundy, although it wasn't called Little Burgundy when I was growing up. But for tonight's presentation, I'm going to use that term as a contrast to many of some of as many as a contrast to the geographical references that I might use, which come from the literature. My roots are generations deep in the city. I have degrees from both Concordia and McGill University, and for decades I've been writing about the city and its history. And beyond the books you see here, I've spent decades writing papers and producing hundreds of articles on various subjects regarding the historical Black impact in the city and beyond. Tonight's presentation will be special. Why? Because this is actually my very first presentation ever given about the Black Community Central Administration of Quebec, which is what I'm going to be talking about. I've never actually put it together. I've written about it, but not done a presentation on it. So just a little bit more about me before we get into the crux of tonight's presentation. I grew up during the 60s and 70s, a pivotal time in the city and in the province's history. And so for purposes of this presentation, I would say that my historical consciousness emerged at the critical juncture of history as Little Burgundy was being raised. So those that remember the Jean Drapeau era, the development of the Ville-Marie Expressway, and the leveling of some of the residential areas in Montreal. And this was even before the gentrification took hold in the Southwest. So the physical erasure of the urban landscape in the Southwest is one of the underlying elements leading to the emergence of the BCCAQ, which is the organization I'm going to be focusing on. And it actually led to the reshaping of Black institutional structures, both within that region and within the island area as well. So I'm going to go into this in more detail later. To that end, this talk's in three parts. So the earliest threads of this narrative actually began almost 100 years ago. And being mindful of our limited time, I'm going to just summarize the five first decades, and we'll pick up pace in the decade preceding the establishment of the BCCAQ, the Black Community Central Administration of Quebec. And then to close our topic, I'm going to dive into the emergence of new unifying elements and bring them all together. These are really, really broad periods, but I'm trusting that the demarcations that I have here is going to lessen some of the confusion as we go through it. I know some listening here to me tonight have little knowledge of the city's Black history and even less understanding of the premier role of the Negro Community Centre. However, this is not a history of Blacks in the city. That's not what I'm doing tonight. And it's not a comprehensive nor an official history of the NCC. Rather, I'm going to leave you with new knowledge about the English-speaking Black community and the NCC's footprint on the English-speaking landscape on the island of Montreal. So we begin in 1927 with the establishment of the Negro Community Association, which was created for the benefit of the whole community. Besides its aims, the NCA saw in their mission the improvement of conditions under which all people work, live, and spend their leisure time. They were looking to create a community morale which would bind all people together and give sustaining power to each individual and to the community as a whole. The Negro Community Association eventually became the Negro Community Centre, or NCC. It was mandated to address legal, social, housing, employment, and immigration problems. It complemented the religious social offerings of one of the local Black churches, and particularly Union United Church. And this is not surprising because from the beginning, the Negro Community Centre had been tied to the Union United Church, both in terms of the congregation and also in terms of its organization. Again, I'm not going to go into details about that, but for several decades, the activities of the NCC actually took place inside 3007 de Lille in Saint Henri, and that's the church that you see on your right when you come out of the Lyon-Gru Metro. So let me put this another way for emphasis, because most people are surprised when I talk about this, but for the first 28 years after the establishment of the Negro Community Centre, it was actually headquartered in the basement of Union United Church in Saint Henri, not in the Black Community Centre of Little Burgundy. The NCC was not a center of Black ideology when it was started, such as you had at that time, certainly Black ideology through Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the association just down the street from the Negro Community Center. Rather, the NCC focused on community development and family support. To that end, they partnered with and became integral to many social service agencies in the city to ensure that Black needs were never far from policy decisions. Even before Centraide and before the Red Feather, there was the Financial Federation or Federated Charities. And as you can see from this 1934 fundraising appeal, the NCC was there even as the network of English-speaking organizations developed its tradition of partnerships across the island. Through the NCC, Blacks sat literally at the table, planning social outreach, charity focus, sharing of resources with groups such as the YWCA, the Montreal Day Nursery, the Big Sister Association, the Mental Health Institute, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, the Montreal Council of Social Agencies, the Griffintown Club, and the University Settlement. Within the first decade after the Second World War, the NCC moved to its permanent site at 2035 Coursol. If you look at the image I have here, you'll see that it originally was a church. The building was originally a church built in 1891. But it was at this location that the NCC took on the mantle as the granddaddy of all Black organizations. It had already built prestige through its comprehensive programming, its presence, representation, and advocacy of Blacks in the city. For instance, the NCC catered to the young through its daycare, the very first one in the West End, and its Black senior activities, both special areas of concern to the executive director and social worker, Stanley Clegg, who was there for decades at the NCC. No gaslighting here, so I must reveal that once they moved into that big building from the church basement, the NCC opened itself up to the entire community around it. And this meant for the larger underserved English-speaking population in the area, the NCC became the premier organization for social services, health information, welfare advocacy, juvenile delinquency, and a myriad of other social needs. So for the first 10 years or so, once they moved into that building, almost 50% of the members of the NCC were non-Blacks living in the immediate neighborhood. And not too many people are aware of that fact. And now you are. For the Black families, though, this place was special. For the Black baby boomer generation, the NCC memories, their stories, and lived experiences all revolve around this imposing building in the heart of Little Burgundy. From a church basement to a 3-story converted church within a decade, that building had become the focal point of many activities affecting Blacks throughout the Montreal region. NCC was the place to come to for community experience. And a lot of that had to do with the use of the space. On the first floor, the NCC provided music lessons, a sewing room, a kitchen, a library, and the Walker Credit Union. Situated on the second floor was the day nursery, a dance room where children took lessons in ballet and tap during the day. Adults took rumba and African and calypso dancing, and sometimes had their own community dances as well. It was used for social dances at night, and they had a stage there, which also they used for performances. On the third floor was a wood shop and a home economics room, as well as a recreation space for teens for ping pong. They played ping pong, pool tables were set up, a bar, and they had a separate, when I say a bar, I mean some of the kids sold Coke and 7-Up, etc. Finally, there was a gymnasium on the fourth floor used for the basketball, handball, racquetball, badminton, and even boxing. What really made this building special was what it evoked. This space represented a second home for many parents. They would drop their children off on a Saturday and not come back for several hours, knowing that their child would be in multiple activities from dance to music to recreation, supervised sports, and that this would be monitored and trained by Black adults. For many Black children whose families had moved voluntarily or involuntarily, they found themselves sometimes in a new neighborhood or a new school where they're the only Black child. So just going back to the center on the weekend was a game changer and helped these children to understand they were not alone and that they were not different. Black parents knew this and made the effort to send their children to the NCC, whether they lived off the island, on the West Island, or other boroughs. Having a place of safety can be priceless. I'll end my description of the NCC and its role in the community here about the mid-60s. So my focus thus far has been about its origins, its visions, and its direct impact in the community. In the turbulence of the 60s and 70s, this organization was a lifeline for many. Yet almost as soon as it solidified its presence and eminence in its own building, right in the heart of the historic Black community, three critical forces began to undermine its stature and relevance. And I'm going to approach them chronologically. The first was population upheaval. The Canadian government inaugurated the domestic scheme in 1955 and 1956, up to 1966. By working 1 year as a domestic servant, Caribbean women got landed immigrant status and were able to apply for citizenship. Several hundred women sponsored hundreds of fellow islanders, thus doubling and tripling Canada's West Indian population in a relatively short time. In urban centers, the growth was phenomenal. Montreal went from 5,000 Blacks to 50,000 Blacks in less than 15 years. The second impact or factor was the fallout from the urban renewal and the dispersion of the small Black community living within Little Burgundy. And I'll pause here for a second just to make that point. We're talking about a small Black community of less than 5,000 souls living in the area that today we call Little Burgundy. The community population in that same area, the total population is approximately between 22 and 25,000. Little Burgundy was never a Black space, but the majority of Black people live there. And between 1960 in 1969, Blacks had to become mobile. And the most important reason for their mobility, their exit from the community, was deliberate property destruction and the forced expropriations. And this is actually a snapshot taken of St. Martin Street at that time. Whole blocks were leveled with over 75% of the area's land, and hundreds of dwellings were acquired by the city of Montreal over several years. And this allowed the city to control who lived in the neighborhood. Vacant lots remained undeveloped for years. With tenements demolished, scores of families were forced to either relocate, sometimes 2 or 3 times in the neighborhood. Oh, you have to move here. Oh, and so you live there 2 or 3 years, and then a family has moved another 2 or 3 blocks over. And so for some, they got fed up with the uncertainty, and they actually left the neighborhood for good. The number of Blacks who could or wanted to return to Little Burgundy, the numbers went down, it really dwindled. Hundreds of Blacks never returned, even when housing became available. They were comfortably settled in other areas. Now, the third George Williams affair was the third factor, and perhaps the most important factor of the three. The Sir George Williams affair, sometimes referred to as Perry Anderson affair, happened at today's Concordia University. Make no mistake, it was a watershed moment in the development of Black community organizations in Montreal. Amazingly, despite the riot or the melee that ensued, few Montrealers today even know about this event. I know because I've given talks on it. Like, what? We had that, yeah. So I get to share some quick facts with you. And I just want to say I can't stress enough how this singular event figures prominently in our story today. This is an extremely short synopsis of that months-long event. When I say months-long, it actually started in academic year 1967-69. Students demonstrated, boycotted, protested, and negotiated on behalf of fellow students for what they believe were racially biased grades given by a professor named Perry Anderson. In February 1969, police broke up a 2-week-long student sit-in beside the computer center on the 9th floor of the Hall building. On the day the police were called to remove the students, destruction occurred and the immediate area in the downtown was locked down. This is Mackay Street, by the way, between Dennison and Sherbrooke. So what you see are the administrative pieces of paper that were thrown out of the window, and some computer papers as well. Those are sitting on the ground. Now, estimates range between 100 and 300 student protesters were involved, but they came in the middle of the night. So a lot of students had gone home. They were ready to come back the next day. These included several dozen students from Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, Guyana, Dominican Republic, Barbados, and various African countries. And most of those students, I'd say 99% of them, they were the brightest students coming from their countries. They were here on scholarships, and they were protesting what they saw was a racist administration. And of course, this had been going on for months back and forth, between the students and the administration. Of the 97 students caught there, police arrested 42 Blacks. So my understanding is that all the white students who were arrested that were involved were let go eventually. But the 42 Blacks, particularly those that were foreign, that had come on scholarship, they arrested those. Those are the ones that eventually wound up going to trial. So because they arrested the 42 Blacks, the student event becomes a Black affair. And so the Sir George Williams affair is forever remembered as a Black student event and a Black community issue. Now, I mentioned that there were 3 factors, so I've gone through the 3 factors, but each factor or cause can be expanded but this is not the time nor place to do that. Google, of course, can help you, if you're interested in the looking at what the population explosion did right across the country, particularly in Montreal. My books will help with that. But then there are other articles that have been written, particularly as we've hit the 50-year quote, anniversary of the Sir George Williams affair and the apology from the university, et cetera. So there's a lot of stuff been written about the Sir George Williams affair as well. And of course, urban renewal in Little Burgundy. But at this juncture, I'm going to begin to connect the dots, and that will help you to see the emergence of the organizational legacy from the NCC. But I just thought it was cute putting dots just to show you they're all related to each other, at least in this particular storyline that I'm sharing with you this evening. So number 1, the West Indian immigrants explode Black populations, eventually doubling and tripling Canada's West Indian population in a relatively short time. 2 things happened with this sea change. First, these thousands of Blacks entering the city of Montreal forever changed the character of the city, with the establishment both of island associations and the prominence of Caribbean culture. Island associations began to serve as point of reference for Montreal's Black communities. They eventually supplanted that community-based identity, which had been developing for the first 3 decades with the NCC, right? The 60s landscape now added ethnic origins such as Jamaica Association, Guyanese Association, Barbados House, and the granddaddy of all, the Trinidad and Tobago Association. The second and most impactful consequence, and perhaps even more to the point about the NCC, is that it was a post-war immigration. And so these Blacks coming into Montreal, their own island nations were pushing for independence and autonomy. They were trying to do this early decolonization that was going on. They were coming into Montreal with very different ideas about their identity, about their own autonomy, about the right to be seen as citizens, etc. And like most post-war immigrants, talking Poles, Germans, whatever, French, whatever, For the post-war, really, the sort of the immigrant population that came in after, as opposed to those that came before, they really were affected by what that war and the I guess the massive change and sea change in the way they saw the world. It's no different with these Blacks coming into the city. Their world had changed, and so also their perspectives were different. They had a different attitude and they wanted different options from the NCC. So that, coupled with the urban renewal, changed Black life in Little Burgundy because the district was no longer the draw it had been for 7 decades. Here's the district as was drawn up in the 1960s. The X, the red X, marks the spot where the NCC would have been. Once it was the neighborhood, once this was the neighborhood to settle into, this is where Blacks came to settle when they came into the city. At one time, it was the launch pad for Black mobility. One time, it was home for 90% of Blacks in Quebec. And once it was the beacon luring Blacks from all over to a unique place, a haven. This is where the Black porter culture was developed. It was close to sort of the residential bedroom community, if you will, of the jazz culture, which was actually more to the east. But this was very, very critical place for Black identity until the 60s. By the late 60s, the intractable forces came with the expropriations, the forced evictions, the destruction of hundreds of homes. And so that meant the community, once the core of Black life on the island, it just crumbled. Really, it just did. Because it no longer was a reception area, no longer the place for Blacks to go when they got off the plane. Or they came by car looking for, where are the Black people? Where can I get a room? Where can I stay? Where can I settle? So what does that mean? Well, if you were to ask 100 Blacks, even today, about their time in Little Burgundy, barely 5 of them would have any information about Little Burgundy because they never ever went there. They never grew up there. It wasn't their home. As traumatic as the urban, sorry, there we go. As traumatic as the urban renewal was, the effect of the 1969 Sir George Williams affair propelled the NCC leadership to change course. To be clear, the crisis at Sir George Williams affected the 2 major institutions in the Black community. That is the Negro Community Centre and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to focus on the effect on the NCC. Energized by the events at Sir George Williams University, youth formed the Black Action Party. At the NCC, BAP as it was called, instituted a series of cultural and educational activities designed to politically and historically re-educate the community. This was a milestone for the NCC as they instituted the first Black studies in Montreal. And I know we're celebrating that Concordia is going to have the first minor in Black studies in all of Quebec universities. But in community education level, at that level, that was going on at NCC decades earlier. By 1971, the Black Action Party and other groups stepped up pressure within the NCC to deal with worsening racial conflicts in other boroughs. The framework was set, but the NCC was just one funded organization located in one borough. Bowing to the continued pressure from the Sir George activists, the NCC asked community animator, graduate student Carl Whitaker, to investigate and report back how the NCC could address the organizational vacuum for Blacks living outside of the historical Black community. Whitaker's report lit the spark beyond BAP. Suggesting a 5-year trial period, these 3 recommendations here were proposed and forever altered Black organizational life in the city. The new entity, the Black Community Central Administration of Quebec, or BCCAQ, you're going to hear me saying that a lot tonight, was located in the NCC. And so what he was trying to do, or what he was responding to in terms of his mandate, is how does the NCC, located in the historic Southwest, that small little district of Little Burgundy, how does it help Black people in LaSalle? There's no Black organization there. How does it help Black people in an NDG or Cote-de-Neige or wherever the clusters of Blacks are moving? And so that's what these recommendations were supposed to give a lifeline, if you will. Its new structure connected multiple organizations and programs, and this was a game changer. For now, the NCC was tasked with expanding its oversight, its fiduciary responsibility, community development, and community building became the focus. And that was beyond, and what was, I think, different about it was that their focus now had to be beyond the boundaries of what we called Little Burgundy at that time. You needed to think about community-wide development. What did that entail? So it was beyond Little Burgundy's borders. Now, Articles B and C that I showed you just earlier speak about the form of operations, how one should develop partnerships, who we should incorporate with, what the leadership looks like outside of Little Burgundy. So, but what is important here again tonight for our purposes is the first recommendation. The suggestion was to spread the NCC mandate into other neighborhoods. And this is what the NCC did in 1972. It opened small storefront operations or branch services in several districts with significant clusters of Black residents. It offered counseling, daycare, and after-school and other programs. Initially manned mostly by volunteers, these NCC satellites ran collective activities such as summer camps and cultural affairs. And the BCCAQ even produced a newsletter, Focus Umoja, to report on its activities and its operations. So the headquarters of the BCCAQ sitting in the NCC, but directing Black community development in these three critical areas. Now, Focus Umoja became the voice of the BCCAQ, and it covered community life with emphasis on culture, politics, and education. In case you're wondering, Umoja means unity, the concept that on paper, the BCCAQ was promoting, though not everyone saw it that way. The NCC storefronts opened in NDG, LaSalle, and Cote-de-Neige, districts where there were no previous history of Black organizing, but of course now had growing clusters of Black residents. And these storefronts were to be semi-autonomous, connected to NCC goals and values, but still nimble enough to respond to specific local needs. However, the NCC workers and local community volunteers quickly realized they could not keep up. And further, they had no capacity to handle the needs of the high immigrant numbers. The most vocal against the BCCAQ model was Leroy Butcher, who oversaw Cote-de-Neige. Butcher had a vision for a dynamic organization based upon a model of programming. The popular model that was used then for the NCC and most organizations in North America as a whole was called animation. I think we still use that term. And Butcher believed it was a static vision or a static model because what animation means and the way he described it is you go out, you get people, you organize them for an action or an activity, but once the action is finished, that's the end of that. And Butcher believed the needs of the Black community were far more profound and that animation was does not lead to any kind of critical analysis, any kind of call to action. And he did not like that model that the NCC was using. And he felt that they could not be effectively resolved using the animation method. So capitalizing on the grand swell of grassroots politicization, which had begun in Cote-de-Neige due to the post-Sir George student movement, there were a lot of students. In fact, I think even today, it's the borough with the highest number of students living in the area. Butcher began to run his satellite office as a socio-political unit. And he also looked for his own revenues to lessen the dependence on the NCC. Now, remember, this is supposed to be a satellite office of the NCC. So it's really the NCC in Côte-de-Neige, not according to Butcher. The project, as sometimes it was called, developed business ventures and supported the establishment of daycare center, children's store, meat buying and packing business. He also, the project actually owned a residential building. Self-sufficiency was the new principle which guided the policy at the Cote-de-Neige project. And this was in opposition to the reliance that the NCC had on funding from the wider community through the Red Feather Agency, through foundations, through fraternal groups like the Shriners, Kinsmen, and whatever, that would raise funds for the NCC. It also was in opposition to the idea of oversight. I'll get that in a minute. But in this way, the way that Butcher set up the Cote-de-Neige project, it really made it a unique organization for its time. Meanwhile, down in Little Burgundy, the Cote-de-Neige project, or the organization, whenever I hear people refer to it as, I always think of a mob or something, I don't know. Anyway, it was called the organization. It did not sit well with everyone. Butcher took autonomy to the next level and in some ways created oversight issues that were threatening to the viability of the entire project, because the NCC had to report to the Red Feather. They had to report to other organizations about what they were doing. And inevitably a question would come up about, well, what's going on in Côte-de-Neige? So locally, that is within Little Burgundy, not everyone liked the model of the BCCAQ because Leroy's rogue actions in Côte-de-Neige, running this operation separately from NCC protocols, just simply validated for them some of their pushback, like we've got to do something, because the BCCAQ model drained resources from the local Black community, or at least that's how they saw why they were getting less resources into the community. And I guess I'm not so much a scapegoat, but it seemed to be one of the reasons in their minds. And the back and forth strident voices got so loud and acrimonious that by 1977, it attracted the attention of the Montreal Star. One of the reporters reported that at the annual general meeting in 1977, the board chairman, Vero, called for an end to the debilitating civil war tearing apart the community with rightist versus leftist, old guard versus against new guard. And perhaps, his call for reconciliation was a little bit too little, too late. For the forces of division and independence eventually overpowered the forces of unity. The BCCAQ began to crumble under the weight of competing internal and external forces. So though they may not have liked the paternal relationship with the NCC oversight, each organization formed itself securely around the model laid out from the parent, except for Cote-de-Neige, of course. The discord became somewhat moot in 1980, specifically September 1980, when the new NCC bylaws made no reference to the BCCAQ. Still, out of the NCC BCCAQ, we have the beginning of a model for independent Black organizations in Montreal. It was that same neighborhood model fostered by Whitaker's old report. First, you had the Coronation Black Community Association. So just to give you, I put both on the same slide, the red triangle, upside down triangle. This is actually a booklet that was created by the Coronation Project, talking about some of their entrepreneurial ventures and what their concept was. And then this is the more current, I guess, logo reflecting the BCA, the Coronation BCA. So you may be wondering what happened to the two other NCC storefronts. Now, remember, they only had a 5-year mandate under Whitaker's plan. So what's next? Unfortunately, the infighting had curtailed what next discussion. And so with the collapse of the BCCAQ, a vacuum developed. And these fledgling organizations grouped with other organizations. And in 1982, the Black Community Council of Quebec, or the BCCQ, was operating. In effect, the original BCCAQ model had not died. It was just not under the NCC anymore, but rather in collaboration with the NCC. Interestingly, the NCC remained the face of activities in the beginning, but throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the BCCQ, the new Black umbrella, coordinated collective activities such as festivals. So you'd hear Black festivals in Montreal bring Blacks from all the boroughs into this festival, art fairs, camps, picnics, and sports leagues. These storefront models continued into the 90s when there was a spate of new incorporations. The NDG Black Community Association formalized its corporate body in 1995, but it's gone. The LaSalle Black Community Association formally incorporated in 1996, but it's gone as well. These were the initial BCAs of the English-speaking Black community. Sadly, as I mentioned, of the 3 original BCAs, only Coronation remains active. But the news is not all bad. Today, you may also spot the West Island BCA or WIBCA. And then there is the South Shore BCA, and I believe they're coordinating now out of Brossard. And until the recent death of the founder, Althea Seaman, who established the bilingual Ville Laval BCA in March 1995, it's unclear if that organization is still operating. However, Census Canada noted Laval has experienced the highest growth of Black settlement, so the need continues, whether it's under this moniker or otherwise. Just for those listening who may never have been aware of the institution before this evening and are not aware of its sad demise, here's a picture of the collapse of the west wall of the building, the NCC, April 1st, 2014. There are just a few stones on a lot today, but the building is not forgotten for the thousands who walked its halls. And that leads me to the point of my presentation, the legacy. Though the building that housed the NCC is no more, the legacy of this granddaddy organization continues unabated. The BCAs, on island, off island, are part of Quebec's Black English-speaking institutional heritage. I trust this presentation has helped you to see how it came about. The legacy is there. It's not been forgotten, and it's there for all to see. So thank you for listening. I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. That was amazing. The just amount of detail and nuance. I'm very impressed. So yeah, we're going to go to Q&A now. For our Zoom participants, I invite you all to turn your webcams back on. If you like, if you have a question, the easiest way to let us know is to click on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll find a reaction icon, and from there you can select the raise hand, and that will put a little hand beside your name on Zoom. And then we'll just we'll queue you up, and we can unmute you. You can also just let us know in the Zoom chat that you have a question. You can even type your question there, and we'll read it on your behalf. For Facebook, YouTube viewers, just leave your question or comment in the chat box. I kind of want to, I was noticing in the lead up to this talk on some of the promotion we did, just how many memories people were sharing about the importance of the NCC in their lives. It clearly was a monumental community force, and it really isn't forgotten. I was really touched just to see, we put a Facebook ad, but all these people commenting their precious memories there. Something I wanted to follow up on. I got the sense that, you mentioned that Little Burgundy was never, an entirely black neighborhood, although most blacks at one point lived there.
Yes.
You also mentioned the fact that the NCC served a diverse clientele, blacks and non-blacks,
Yes.
50% non-black. I think you said. Do you, in your mind, did that have an impact on race relations within that neighborhood or within that general southwest of Montreal?
No. You mean the fact that blacks and whites would go to the NCC at
I mean,
lunchtime after school and partake in the
yeah,
activity?
like
Yeah.
did they begin socializing? Like, I mean, in your book, there's obviously you're pointing out a lot of like discrimination blacks faced, just kind of what we've come to expect. But like in that neighborhood, were there alliances being built between the black community and the other communities living in the area, or is there still kind of an implicit segregation?
No, there's not segregation the way you're thinking, but as I told you, but being a minority in that community, even in the amongst the English speaking blacks, because that was also the center of the largest Italian community in the Southwest, and the English Catholic community, St. Anthony's Church was the largest parish. So there was a huge English speaking population there. And blacks were just one community that was part of that English speaking mix. We went to school together because there was one school that put everybody that wasn't Catholic in this one building, right? So we had Jewish, we had Jews, we had Chinese, we had Ukrainians, we had Swedes, we had uh, the Italians went to the English speaking Catholic community or English speaking schools. But there were like 4 schools just for the French Catholics. But in our neighborhood or in the communities that we focused on, those same kids that we played, we skipped with in the schoolyard. We walked together hand in hand towards the NCC, it was like 3 blocks away. We all spent the days together and spent our early or late afternoons before we went home for supper. Yeah, so it wasn't that kind of charge. I think as we got older, of course, we went our own separate ways anyway. And by then the community had really changed, at least for me, for my generation. It was changing almost on a weekly basis. A family that you grew up with that was living beside you, they would be getting a letter saying that they'd have to move in 6 months, and sometimes they found something in 2, 3 weeks. They'd be gone, and they'd be moving. And in those days, we didn't have that sort of, oh, don't move your kids in the middle of the school year. They just took off. So things are always changing. Yeah, no, that was part of it. And also because the NCC itself was given as a gift from the Iverly Community Centre, which came out of the university settlement model. And they wound up moving up to Saint Laurent because, like the NCC, they saw that their population in that whole area had to move out due to the expropriations. So they followed their client base, if you will, out of Little Burgundy and left the building for the NCC. But the people that they served originally stayed, and they became part of the NCC. That's a
Right.
long answer to your question, but I just wanted
That's
to
it's the
make
way of
sure
the
you know it.
historian.
Yeah.
You mentioned language there, and of course,
Yeah.
I think this comes up often. Something I've always been curious. I don't know enough about. Obviously, at some point, the Haitian community and Francophone Black communities began developing in Montreal. Of course, it seems like there's a strong language focus, maybe more in some than the others in these Black community organizations you describe. Can you talk about how, if there's a relationship with these like, Francophone Black communities as well, or how that plays out in
Oh,
general? I'm
yeah, no,
curious.
well, the period of time we're talking about, we're not talking about the French at all at that point.
In the 70s and
In
80s,
these
was that some,
areas, yeah, no, I'm talking about at the beginning. So we're talking 72, 70. Excuse me, the small, rather the early um movement of Haitians into Montreal. They were a minority of Blacks. They don't take up or become half the population of Black till the early 90s. I mean, now they surpass, right? But
Mhm,
um, at that point, there were very, very small percentage and proportion of Blacks in Montreal.
right.
So the people that were coming in large numbers that needed that kind of support were from the English speaking Caribbean areas.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Right.
no, you didn't have that. That would take a good maybe 30 years because they had Maison Déti and other organizations. They were developing their own organizations, and the thinking at that time was they were only here temporarily anyway. They weren't here to settle in Montreal.
Right. And today, in terms of the Black leadership
Oh yeah, very
of
different
Montreal,
now.
is it's very different now than.
Yeah, very
Gotcha.
different now.
Okay. Any other questions on Zoom? You can use the raise hand or the chat. Let me just check the chat here. Oh, I see someone's got their hand. Matthew Farfan.
Matthew
Okay.
put his hand up.
Hey, Matthew. Did we unmute you correctly? Let's see, Matthew Farfan.
He's muted.
It's okay. I unmuted him. Matthew, I just unmuted you.
Articulate and interesting as usual. Thank you for that,
Thank
Dorothy.
you.
I just had a quick question. The expropriation that was going on in the 60s. Now, was that because of the Ville Marie, the
Yeah,
construction?
well, that was part of it. The other part is that the area that we're talking about is a very, very old area. Some of those homes in the south, Southwest was actually once a bedroom community of Old Montreal. So at one point, the professionals from Old Montreal, this was their suburb. So these houses, some of them were built like in 1830s, 1840s. So by the time Blacks are moving into the residential areas, the houses are really, they I'd say should be condemned. There were some houses that didn't have running water. You had to use an outhouse to go to the bathroom, etc. It really was in need of an urban renewal, separate from the destruction of the homes. Obviously, the political choice to put the highway in the middle of the city and bifurcate a poor area. It seems to have been, well, you could say it's deliberate, but then that also affected, went right up into the Snowden or whatever. There were some, how shall I say, reacting to a global process that was coming with Expo 67, but these plans were put into place um, in the 50s. When you look at the early
Mm,
reports that were coming out, because they knew they had to rejuvenate, they had to take care of what they considered to be slums, that they had allowed these houses to deteriorate, allowed the landlords to get away with not doing repairs, and people living in substandard housing. It couldn't be
yeah.
tolerated, so they wanted to really clean it up. Yeah.
Interesting. While I'm on unmuted, I have a second question. I understand the funding for the NCC changed over time, right? From the early days until the later. Where did most of the funding? You mentioned the state at one point.
Well,
Was
they
it the
stayed,
Quebec?
yeah. The NCC had a social work model when it started. And so we're talking from the early 30s right up until, well, gee, when I was executive director, they were still on point with that social work model vis-a-vis the funding. So
Mm,
it ended with Centraide funding
I see.
before the
Okay.
building was closed. But before that, it was Red Feather. And as I said before that, you had whatever the council agency fundings were. Yeah, because they allowed the NCC, or the NCC allowed itself to be used for like the diet dispensary, to give vitamins and special foods, fruit, whatever, to pregnant women and stuff, a dental clinic and things like that through the agency of the Montreal Council of Health, etc. So that's how they got most of their funding. The new areas of funding happened after the building closed in 1989.
I see. Okay, good. Thank you.
Matthew. I have a couple questions here in the Zoom chat. Michelle is asking, what do you personally recall most fondly from the NCC? We're assuming, yeah, you went to that programming. I don't know
But
if
of
it's a
course,
safe assumption. What
well,
are your
some of
fondest
the
memories, Dorothy?
I didn't do any of the sports, but I did home. Actually, it was my first foray into cooking. So I did take lessons there. Probably most fondly remember doing music lessons with Daisy Sweeney, Oscar Peterson's sister. I took tap with and ballet actually. Both my sister and I. We took dance lessons as well. And I probably I can't forget my political kind of training. We had I don't think they called it story time, but we had lessons on African kings and queens and about Black glory and history, how we did things or invented or whatever. And those kinds of stories, that was a part of our team club. And so I participated in that as well.
Thank you for that, Dorothy. Heather's asking, she really liked your images in your presentation, and she was wondering, were an archive of images ever gathered from the NCC into an archives?
I don't know. Probably that's going to happen at Concordia. Concordia has seems to have invested quite a bit of money and resources now into the Black Archive built around the NCC archives. So I suspect that that's probably going to be the premier, if not already the premier place for Black archival material. But most
I
of the stuff that I have comes from my own archive. So what you saw was just clips out of my own archives.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. But actually, can you tell us a bit about the story? I was under the impression that those records were from the NCC were quite endangered when they were found. I don't know the whole story, but do you know anything about that? It's not, it's fairly recent too, I believe, in the last
No,
10
it's
years, I
not
guess.
recent.
10 years?
No.
Okay, so I guess it was well before it was demolished, but I guess the
Well,
building
well,
was
well
in the various
before.
states of
Yeah.
decrepitude.
Okay, so you're going to force me to say that it was because of me.
No, I wasn't. I actually don't know the story. But
Yeah, no.
if you need to self-aggrandize, though, you can.
Yeah, well, it was.
All right, you
Actually,
permission.
no,
Go ahead, Dorothy. Please tell us.
well, I was the last executive director of the Negro Community Centre. I don't know if you're
I didn't
heard.
know that.
Okay, I
No.
guess I should have made that a little bit more transparent. So at one point, I wound up running the organization, and I was the last executive director. I closed the building when it officially closed. Centric money ran out, and that was in 1989. The groundswell of, oh no, how could we close the building, led to the building being open without the proper resources. There was no electricity, there was no insurance, whatever. And that went on for several years in a very dangerous situation. And the new board was constituted, calling itself the NCC Charles H. Est building. It still exists, or it did exist, for at least 2.5 decades. But about 5 years into that, say at about mid-90s, I realized that if something is not done, all of the papers and the records of the NCC would be lost forever. So I made contact with Concordia University Archives, and we just did a guerrilla move one day. I got a hold of the key. We got a van, and we just emptied the building of every single piece of paper we could find.
Excellent.
And then
Well,
that wound up being put into storage for several years, and then it kind of moved around the neighborhood. It eventually wound up where it should have been in the first place, which was at Concordia, except that in the initial time that we took all of those papers and all of the artifacts that are now at Concordia University, there was no funding. Yeah, you take an archive on, it's a very expensive process. You've got to hire archivists and you've got materials and all kinds of things that need to be purchased. It's a very expensive process. But having the archives at the Concordia University certainly gives the university that kind of cachet, if you will, to set up this first Black undergraduate program or a degree, and will support further research years later. And now that we've got that archive there, a lot of other Blacks are saying, oh, somebody wants Black materials before we just throw them in the garbage. I mean, you lose decades of papers, collections, and stuff like that. But it's becoming the place to go to deposit your records now.
well, I promise that wasn't a setup, Dorothy, but I'm not surprised you were involved. But I actually didn't know. So thanks for that. So apologies for any awkwardness, but thanks for sharing that story. Those records are now publicly available for
Yes.
research purposes. That's amazing. Great to see that they get to be used for future researchers. I don't see any more questions here on Zoom. Let me just take a quick look. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I just want to wrap up by extending my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Williams. Check out her website, www.dorothywilliams.ca. You can learn more about her many publications and projects. If you're an educator interested in incorporating more Black Canadian history into your courses, definitely check out the ABCs of Black Canadian History teaching kit that she's helped produce. I believe Linton Garner's also involved in that, and he's another huge figure in Black and English speaking leadership in the province. Information about the ABC kit can be found on Dr. Williams' website as well as at blackbiblio, BLACBIBLIO.com. And if you are a student, Dr. Williams' course on Black Montreal, it's a core part of the curriculum in Canada's new minor in Black and African Diasporic Studies in Canadian context at Concordia. So I want to thank our sponsors once again. We have the Zeller Family Foundation and Canadian Heritage for your support. As always, a very special thanks to our tech producer, Allison Kirkwood, for her brilliant work behind the scenes on Zoom, Facebook Live, and YouTube. All of our Heritage Talks are archived on Quan's YouTube channel if you'd like to share today's talk with family or friends, or perhaps you want to browse our back catalog of online Heritage Talks from the past 4 years now. And please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you find yourself there. Finally, thanks to all of you who joined us on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. We appreciate your support and the lively discussion that you bring. We're taking a few weeks off Heritage Talks to give Allison a brief reprieve while she helps out with the flurry of St. Patrick's season activities that are taking place up around Quebec City. As a side note, if you missed our Ireland to Quebec broadcast from last weekend, you can also find that on the Quan YouTube channel. We'll be back in a month's time with a Heritage Talk that ties in beautifully with tonight's talk. On April 3rd at 7 p.m., we'll be joined by the leadership of the West Can Folk Performing Company, Malika Ford and Shiata Lewis Rouse. They'll be telling us the story of the Black West Indian families who settled in Montreal in the 60s and 70s and created this wonderful grassroots organization for passing on Caribbean folk culture to successive generations of Caribbean Montrealers. That's all for today. Have a great evening, everyone.